Thank you, Kel, and thank you all for joining this webinar series, the first of two parts. Our second part is coming up pretty quickly on May 2nd at 4 p.m. again, where we will be talking about building EJ principles into our community benefit agreement negotiations and outcomes. And so that really will be more of a hands-on conversation where you can kind of learn through examples of what the existing community benefit agreements are and how we can build them into something that is good for the communities and good for us and really lay out the groundwork for the future of equity in offshore wind. With that being said, the recording for this session will be sent out and shared, and I invite everyone to stick around for the next 15 minutes or so. Drop your Q&As into the chat so Jennifer can take a look at them, and we have the panelists here to answer some questions. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Zara. I'm Jennifer Deloney. I'm the Offshore Wind Communications Director at the Environmental League of Massachusetts, and I work directly with the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition to make sure that we have a strategic direction for our communications. And a large part of why we're here today is because I heard many questions, many concerns about how CBAs should be negotiated, how they will be completed in the years to come for the communities that will be affected most. So that's why we're here. This part one is intended to get us into the conversation. And then part two really is an opportunity for us to look more closely at the equitable and significant environmental justice issues that we're facing as these agreements are made. And you may or may not know that we have recently, as a coalition, developed a set of environmental justice values that everyone has agreed on, and we have all passed as our overarching set of values for everything that we do. And as part of that effort, we have begun to think about communications around community benefits agreements and potentially putting out a set of EJ principles for CBAs, their negotiation, their outcomes, the agreements themselves. This is something that's ongoing, but it's a conversation that we will begin in this part two, and I hope you will all join us for that. So with that in mind, I do have a couple of questions that I want to put out to our panelists, but I just want to make sure that we jump in with a few that have been dropped in here first. And one is a question for the mayor, and it says, what was the timeline for how the city and community organizations began laying the groundwork for a CBA and initiating the negotiation process?
Thanks. Yeah, I can respond to that. So in Salem, our CBA, our CBA was not prompted. Angela mentioned that the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act prompts CBAs for certain projects, and this project actually is not receiving funding through either of those two federal funding sources. It is getting federal funding through a separate DOT program with the Maritime Administration, but the CBA was prompted by a cooperation agreement that the city and the previous administration had entered into with Crowley as part of the process of closing on the transfer of the real estate of the port itself. That cooperation agreement spelled out the requirement that they enter into a community benefits agreement with the city. And then in the course of the change in administration, with the approach of these organizations from the community that reached out requesting that it'd be a broader effort. I saw really a lot of value in that. And so we kind of undertook that process instead of a unilateral negotiation with just the city and Crowley. We started those discussions I was sworn in at the end of May of last year. We started really kind of gathering feedback from the stakeholders in the community, and those conversations started pretty quickly right away in June and July. It took about 9 months altogether. So from July through the summer into September, we engaged in that kind of feedback collection process and those early discussions around setting those shared values. Put together our initial set of proposals for Crowley in October, and then from November through January, had a series of, I can't even remember how many negotiation sessions with Crowley and SOA members in the city, in between having additional conversations with SOA and just the city to kind of level set around what had happened in the negotiation discussions, and really reached finalization in February when the legal counsels for everybody finished putting together the actual documents based on the terms that had been set. There was a degree of leverage available because there was some pressure on Crowley around the closing of the property and the sales, and so a need to finish these agreements, the project agreements, the PLA, the community host, the community benefits agreement, in tandem with the closings that were coming up. And the cooperation agreement spelled that timeline out. So we were kind of operating under that larger umbrella.
Thank you so much for that clarification. I wonder, we have another question, Angela, that you might be able to define for us. It's asking, how is a host community agreement different from a community benefit agreement? And, certainly we have to understand that there are going to be many different terminologies running around, but do you think you can take a stab at that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And thank you to the mayor for clarifying that before. So I'll answer in two parts. But first, a host community agreement is typically negotiated between the municipality and the developer, while as CBAs are typically negotiated between coalition groups, community groups, and developers. So here in Salem, we do have a unique situation in which what we're defining as a CBA is really being signed with the municipality and the developer, and that is because of the cooperation agreement that was entered before that stated that that was the way the negotiation process was going to happen, which is why SAFE and so was persistent in being part of the negotiation, and getting legal representation by CLF was really crucial towards getting a community voice at the table, and being part of at least the negotiating process, or it really would have been kind of, only from the city official perspective. So it did take effort there to make sure that the community group still was able to see the terms and make sure that they were on board with the terms.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You'll see we've shared here a graphic that has some examples of agreements that have been made, 3 of them in 2024, which is outstanding. One isn't necessarily an agreement, but it is more of a program that has been funded that will shoot benefits to communities. All the details there are a little unknown at this point, but I will send this out along with the video. I highly encourage anybody I talk to when they're learning about some of the complicated issues that happen in the energy industry to go to the original documents, those primary resources. And that's what I've linked these to, are the actual agreements where you can read the language and there's no middleman there. You are understanding what was agreed to there. So when you see this come through, click through if you've never seen those agreements and give them a little read. I want to just wrap us up here for the official hour with a couple of questions for our panelists, but also note that we're going to keep some office hours from 5 to 5:15, and people are allowed to stay and keep asking questions. We'll hang around for a little while, but officially want to just thank everybody so much for taking the time to join us here, and we hope to see you for the next one. But just to wrap us up, I'm thinking about the idea of standards for community benefits agreements, and how, of course, every community is different. Every agreement is going to have its own set of differences, but as a group of stakeholders around a project, an infrastructure project, or a facility comes together to think about how to bring this together, they potentially are thinking, oh, are there already a set of standards out there for how the community approaches it? Or legally, what are the best pathways for us to follow? Or from a labor perspective, where do we look? And so I'm hoping all of you would be able to just jump in for a minute and talk about the idea of standards, whether you think there's a pathway for them, something that already potentially exists. And Frankie, I'm going to throw it at you first.
Okay. Well, I'll talk about labor standards. That's what I'm here for. And so when we're thinking about community benefit agreements, I'll say it again, it'll be the last time I say establishing clear benchmarks for hiring, super important because of reasons of accountability and to make sure you're just on the same page when you're talking about hiring goals. But when we're thinking about standards in terms of a living wage, for example, both project labor agreements and community benefit agreements can be really crucial in making sure that workers who are hired are being paid a prevailing wage, maybe a local wage set by local unions, which is typically a higher wage than their non-unionized counterparts, or particularly than independent contractors might be paid. And when thinking about those standards as well, I know that the Salem CBA has, I think, 75% across that timeline of union hires for the project. I think that's really great because a union worker is going to have benefits. They're going to have health insurance, paid sick leave, time off, maybe bereavement leave. They're going to have access to workers' compensation, all sorts of really important things that become even more important when you're doing somewhat dangerous work like this. So really allowing workers and organized labor unions, consortiums, a voice at that table is important, because without those voices, the developers will set the standards for labor, and those standards are always going to be better when the people who are actually performing the work and on the front lines of these projects are able to have a say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Frankie. Angela, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you for the question. It's a great one. And then to clarify a point that I made earlier, the reason to bring up the IRA and IIJA, or BIL, two different ways of saying the same law, kind of guidance on CBAs, is because those are kind of the federal standards that exist on CBAs. So it might not have applied in this particular project, but there is at least federal guidance on the way in which the negotiation process should occur. And the portions that I mentioned in terms of the negotiation process being transparent and being inclusive, and I think involving coalitions, and that means that, you know, it might not just be one coalition group. It could be taking surveys of the community, asking different questions, seeing what the general consensus is on these questions, and that takes a lot of grassroots organizing, and that can be time consuming. But in order for the CBA to be really reflective of what the community needs and wants are, that process is important. So on the state level, we're not seeing a lot of state guidance, although that might change with what happens in terms of the Siting Commission and this legislative session. We might see more documents on the way in which CBAs should be negotiated. And I think we should be mindful that they're not a perfect solution to kind of correct historical injustices. That it's a tool right now, and we have to ensure on making that tool as useful as process. But it's not a quick fix. And I think those are important things to keep in mind. But as long as communities are at the heart of the negotiation process and people are at the heart of the process, I think that ensures a smoother document and agreement moving forward that will impact the community for years.
All right. Do you have anything that you want to add in there?
I'll just say, I think that standards are great. I mean, every community is different. The needs in every community are different, but the larger tent poles that are around this industry, around workforce and labor and economic growth and opportunities for supply chain, supporting our local economy, related to sustainability and resilience, and education, like those things are pretty consistent in the values that I think are shared throughout communities, just tailoring it to what your local needs are. I think the other standards that would be helpful is this concept of CBAs for clean energy industry in the future is developed is around process. You know, Angela touched on this, that the Salem process was definitely unique, and it's not going to be the same everywhere, but having some standards around like who does get to be at the table and make that decision. I think one of the things we struggled with in Salem is we have neighborhood associations of 1 or 2 people, and they consist of a Facebook group. And if they say that they're part of the coalition, then do they get to also come to the table and make demands in this process? So having some standards around process would also be, I think, very important as this continues to be I think, an important way of ensuring our communities are supported during these projects.
It's an incredibly important consideration. Do you have a thought about, where would that set of standards come from? Should it be a state level? Can you imagine it being a federal level standard?
Possibly. I think it depends on who's setting the standards at the federal level before I'd be willing to say concede that point. But every community is different. I think even if it's just a best practice that everyone can look to and point to and say, this is consistently the way that ensures all of the important voices that need to be at the table or around the table as these are developed.
Okay. All right, well, I'm not going to let you off the hook yet. I have another question for you. And then we're going to, obviously we're at 5, so we're just going to slide into our after hours here. And again, thank you everyone for sticking around if you're going to, or otherwise have a good evening. But I recently was in a conversation with a community member, a leader in a community that is facing the prospect of having to establish a CBA. And the foundation of the goal for that particular community member was to ensure that the community doesn't change as a result of the process of the outcome of the CBA or any of the development that happens. And I thought that was a really interesting point, and I'm curious about if you could share from your experience with Salem, if that ever came across your mind, if you're trying to balance between, saving the heritage and thinking about your clean energy future, and where was that balance?
I don't know that that came entirely into play. Like I said, this site has been used for industrial purposes throughout the entirety of the 20th century and even into the 19th century when it was a coal yard and a rail yard. So I don't think anybody looked at this site and thought we were losing something. I think everybody felt like we were gaining something. It was just a matter of ensuring we had those guardrails to best benefit the community and protect the surrounding neighborhood during the construction process. That got more into the permitting process and what was required of them for permitting. But it really wasn't a how do we keep things from changing. I mean, we're living with some pretty catastrophic storm surge over these last few months, and it's opening everyone's eyes in a new way to the severity and reality of the climate crisis. So as a coastal community that's both feeling the impact of that and has the opportunity to do something positive about it, I think that that didn't really seem to be a challenge that we were facing at Salem. We had other challenges for sure, but that I don't know that was necessarily one.
Thank you so much. All right, so I have a couple of still more questions about Salem in our Q&A here. And actually, this one's more at Massachusetts. So let's see if anyone has some thoughts here. It says, are you aware of any communities in Massachusetts or elsewhere that are developing or have enacted any local bylaw ordinance with respect to required CBAs in terms of these large scale developments? Anyone know of anything like that happening? It certainly hasn't come across my table. Yeah, I don't see any people jumping on to answer yes on that. I think from the coalition's perspective, that would have been actually raised up pretty quickly to us because it would be a significant issue if a local bylaw like that came along. And certainly we would keep an eye out for that. And I appreciate your question. Another one we have here, I think it's thinking more in terms of your answer on the timeline of the negotiation in Salem. It says, were you worried that some groups might be missing from discussions given the short timeline? And how did you make sure the whole community was represented at the table? I think that gets at what you were saying about how that is actually a tricky negotiation.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that in the first few months of this process, I was like, my overriding concern was that there were stakeholders and community organizations and sectors of our community that weren't necessarily being consulted or aware of that this was coming and what it meant. The SOA organization, to their credit, the Alliance did a lot of legwork, reaching out to community groups. We're a small city, 45,000 people, 8 square miles, so it feels like everybody knows each other, and everyone's aware of who the different organizations and entities are. The city, we did some proactive outreach of our own to groups and nonprofits who hadn't fallen within the umbrella of SOA that we felt like it was important to consult. So that initial feedback gathering process I mentioned, that was not just to the SOA Alliance organizations. We reached out to other organizations and entities, city departments, public-private organizations, just to make sure that they had the opportunity to share thoughts and concerns. Now, and I'll make the plug for mayors and for local elected officials. I think that, if you're looking for a single voice that does have at least the support of 50% plus one of the community, having a local leader that's willing to be a champion and part of that process in your community is powerful, whether or not it's coming from a community organization or not. I think it carries a lot of credibility with developers that have to go through a permitting process. They have to go through a regulatory process with the city, that if they see that they have the elected leadership also sitting down at the table as part of this, I think it can be a very powerful.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to shift for a minute to Maine. Frankie, it's really great to have your perspective on this webinar, because I know that things are heating up in Maine in terms of a potential CBA, and I'm wondering if you could just sort of package for anyone who's still on the line, just a quick perspective on why that is. Why is there a possible CBA coming for the Searsport community? And also, it's my understanding that you've maybe connected with some people who are working through this process on the West Coast, and maybe there are some lessons that they've learned that you have picked up on at this point.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and I'll be clear that what I've learned doesn't necessarily translate into what will happen in Maine, but increasingly, I think one of the most important threads in the conversation in Maine is government to government consultation between our tribes and the state. That's been something that hasn't in the past been such a key focus. And increasingly in Maine, there is resources in the form of on-the-ground funding for our 4 tribes, which are in 5 communities here in Maine, for those tribes to engage and have positions and able to be able to study the. So that's really key. Another of the threads going on in Maine is our fisheries. We have a deep maritime heritage here. I come from a fishing family myself. And so that is another party that has been participating in conversations at the leasing and lease permitting and conditions process with BOEM, and as well will probably participate in this community benefits agreement process. The administration here in Maine has announced that they have a preferred location for an offshore wind port, which is in Searsport, Maine. The state is going to be bringing forward within the next month or 2, I understand, their alternatives analysis, and there will be environmental permitting that will follow. And this comprehensive process will allow for continued public input on the final siting of a port. So when we're talking about community benefits agreements, I think there was a question, at what point does this happen? And, I think what we've seen from some of the stories, not just in California, but in other places around the country, is that sometimes a community benefits agreement might be negotiated or discussed a bit prematurely, and then a developer might fall through. I think a memorandum of agreement is a really great way to start to set the stage, or having incentives at the state level for a community benefits agreement as part of the lease, for example, is a really great way to ensure that negotiations like this move forward. So there was a question also from one of the participants about, or maybe you mentioned this, Jennifer, actually, about, like, what are going to be the impacts to the host site? And here in Maine, I'll say Searsport is a really small town, you know, compared to Salem, it's maybe 2,000 people. And so how can we imagine what the impacts will be on the community? Because certainly there will be impacts, particularly with a port, but with an agreement, with a negotiation between the community and a developer, the community can do their best really and to really ensure that there are benefits and that impacts are mitigated. And I think really importantly to bring it back to workforce, that any jobs that are created, whether it be through this project or elsewhere in the country, really, that, you know, local good paying jobs are created. And ideally, I'll say for myself, ideally for many hundreds of thousands of workers around the country, those jobs would be union jobs with the benefits and the protections that come with that. So there's a long road ahead for people in Maine. And we've heard, you know, how it can be complicated, difficult to make sure that all stakeholders are heard. But I think ensuring that negotiation processes are open and transparent is a really important way to make sure that voices are not just heard at the table, but that we can amplify the voices of those people who have been historically marginalized or, you know, harmed by fossil fuel industry.
Those are some really important insights. I mean, I've been connected with our friends up in Maine for this whole process of the port development. I had no idea that Searsport was that small. I mean, that's a tiny community. So I really appreciate that insight and put some more perspective on what they're facing. All right, so I'm going to wrap up last few minutes, and I'm hoping that the mayor will tell us a little bit about what's next. I mean, we know we have this agreement in place, and that's not it. You know, what happens now? What's next on the plate for Salem?
So the bids were submitted for the next procurement, so we're all kind of excited to see how that's going to shake out and what that means for the future use of the site. We're anticipating groundbreaking to happen probably in June. Date's not set specifically yet, but to have it the port operational in time to serve the industry in 2026, 2027. 2026 also happens to be Salem's 400th birthday, our quadricentennial. So we're looking at it as a part of our significant celebration and commemoration of who we are as a community and where we want to go into the future. There's still some state and federal permitting that the port has to work through. And we're anticipating that probably in the next couple of months, we'll be appointing the working group for the CBA that I mentioned earlier. That we have a caller right now for the two resident members to apply. They can send their resume and application to mayor@salem.com, and we're looking forward to appointing them to join the group and get that work underway.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, thank you again, everyone, for sticking around and chatting with us. And I'm going to pass it off to Zara to close us up.
Gonna echo what Jennifer said. Thank you so much for joining us all on your Thursday afternoon into evening. The registration link for our next webinar is in the chat, and we will also send it in our follow-up email May 2nd at 4 p.m. Mark it on your calendars. Thank you so much for joining us today. Bye, everyone.